Today, we will be looking at 14 horrifying caving stories that went horribly wrong. Each story starts with confidence, but ends in chaos. One wrong turn, one mistake, one moment underground, and everything turns into unimaginable terror. As always, viewer discretion is advised. Most tragedies in the underwater cave world begin the same way. A diver goes somewhere they shouldn't. A place too deep, too narrow, too advanced. But the story of Lorena Garcia Martin, a 37-year-old woman from Murcia, is different, because her dive into Cueva del Agua in January 2025 shouldn't just never have happened. It shouldn't even have been possible. This is the story of how one of Spain's most dangerous cave systems, a place only a handful of elite divers can navigate, became the center of a sudden, shocking death, a national debate, and a police investigation that still hasn't quieted down. And it begins on a cold, gray morning in Isla Plana. Cueva del Agua is not a friendly cave. On sunny days, tourists walk right past its nondescript entrance without realizing that only a few meters below their feet lies a maze of flooded tunnels stretching into total blackness. For decades, divers have warned, visibility drops to zero without warning. Passages shrink to barely shoulder width. The silt is so fine that a single misplaced fin kick creates a blizzard. The cave has already claimed lives. It is the kind of place even experts approach with caution. And Lorena was not a cave diver. She was a recreational diver, skilled in open water, comfortable with gear, but absolutely not trained for overhead environments. By every rulebook, every protocol, every logical decision tree, Lorena Garcia Martin should have never crossed the threshold of Cueva del Agua. But on that morning, she did. The details of how exactly that dive was organized are still debated. Some say she joined a small local group she trusted. Others say she believed they were entering only the accessible part of the cave, the tourist zone. And others claim she willingly followed more experienced divers deeper than she understood. But this much is clear. She arrived with a small group. The dive was informal, not part of a certified cave course, and she entered the water wearing standard recreational equipment. No redundant air supply, no cave-rigged setup, no formal cave diving reel. Already the situation was wrong, but from the outside, nothing looked dangerous. The water was calm, the entrance tunnel seemed manageable, the visibility looked decent, and Lorena followed the others inside. For the first several minutes, the dive probably felt magical. The tunnel below the entrance is cathedral-like, pale limestone arching overhead, surfaces polished by centuries of water flow. A recreational diver could almost believe it was safe. But Cueva del Agua is a trap disguised as a tunnel. The deeper you go, the more the walls narrow, the more the silt rises in clouds, the more the water absorbs every glint of light. Somewhere past the point where recreational divers should stop, and cave divers begin, the group continued. At some point, the space tightened. They pressed forward through a winding, constricted passage. And then, the real cave swallowed them. Divers know that losing visual contact is the beginning of disaster. Underwater, you can't yell. You can't signal through solid rock. If someone drifts even a few meters away in murky conditions, you might as well be on different planets. The group pushed forward, but conditions began to change. A diver kicked the floor too hard, and turbulence from the fin disturbed the silt. Instantly, the water turned to gray fog. Lights became weak halos swallowed by the cloud. Someone signaled to slow down. But another diver didn't see it. Someone tried to stay close, but hands missed hands in the dark. In that moment, Lorena became separated. She wasn't cave certified. She wasn't trained in zero visibility. She didn't know the route. She probably didn't know how to find the line. And the cave punished her instantly. This wasn't like losing orientation in open water. Inside a cave, the walls don't let you guess. You can't swim upward. You can't make a safety stop. You can't surface. There is only rock on all sides. Once you're lost, you stay lost. What happens to a diver in those moments is almost always the same, regardless of training. First comes confusion, then comes denial, then the breathing picks up, then panic sets in. In that maze with zero visibility, no reference points, no backup air, and no specialized equipment. Her chances were virtually zero. When the other divers made it out and realized Lorena wasn't behind them, the situation became a nightmare. Divers raced in and out of the entrance trying to relocate her. Someone called emergency services. When the Guardia Civil GEAS unit arrived, Spain's elite underwater police divers, they immediately recognized the problem. This was not a rescue. This was going to be a recovery. Experts entered the cave with specialized gear, redundant lights, multiple tanks, reels, and full cave rigs. The silt was so thick that even they struggled. The tunnels were narrow, visibility was unstable, and the cave system was huge. It took time to find her. Finally, deep inside, in a narrow section far from the entrance, rescue divers saw her silhouette. Lorena was lifeless. She drowned in the twisting passageways, alone in cold, black water. The team worked tirelessly and meticulously brought her body to the surface. Within hours, Spanish media outlets reported the story. A 37-year-old woman dies in Cueva del Agua. But the moment her name was revealed, and people realized she was not cave certified, the narrative exploded. Every major diving forum, club, and instructor in the country asked the same questions. Why was she inside that cave at all? Some divers called it a tragic accident. Others called it negligence. Some called it criminal. And that's exactly where the story took a darker turn. The Guardia Civil did something unusual. They opened a formal investigation into possible responsibility. This almost never happens in recreational diving deaths. Authorities examined the dive group's experience levels, whether Lorena was misled, whether she was properly supervised, whether anyone violated safety rules, whether the dive should have been stopped, whether negligence contributed directly to her death. Witness statements reportedly contradicted one another. Some divers said she entered willingly, knowing the risks. Others said she didn't understand how dangerous it was. Others insisted the group's leader failed to maintain contact. Spanish cave divers, the elite ones, were furious. They had been warning for years that Cueva del Agua needed access control, and now someone had died exactly the way they feared. A diver who should never have entered, followed others into a death maze. After her death, something rare happened. Spain started debating cave diving laws. Diving instructors demanded restrictions. Permit-only access, cave certification checks, physical barriers at the entrance, monitoring of dive groups. Some local officials began discussing legal changes, but others blamed the divers themselves, arguing that no law can stop poor judgment or lack of training. In the middle of all of this was Lorena's family, grieving, confused, and overwhelmed as strangers across the country dissected the final moments of her life. In the end, the only voice missing from this entire story is Lorena's. She can't explain why she entered. Her final minutes remain locked inside the rock and water of Cueva del Agua, a cave that has a long history of silencing divers, and in early 2025 took another. October 4th, 1982. 8 teenagers stood at the Lips entrance of Organ Cave in West Virginia, flashlights in hand, ready for an afternoon of exploration. Organ Cave is one of West Virginia's largest cave systems, stretching over 45 miles through the limestone beneath Greenbrier County. The cave has multiple entrances, commercial tours in certain sections, and vast wilderness areas that draw explorers seeking adventure in its labyrinthine passages. The Lippy's entrance provides access to some of the more remote sections of the system, areas with names like Hell's Fissure, the Maze, Skid Row, and the Sand Floor Room. These weren't tourist routes. These were raw cave passages requiring navigation skills, proper equipment, and careful planning. The group of 8, all in their late teens, entered through the Lips entrance on Sunday afternoon. Their plan was straightforward: explore into Hell's Fissure, a dramatic feature that drew cavers with its imposing geology, then return and perhaps check out some other passages before heading back to the surface. They ventured into Hell's Fissure. After exploring the area, they turned back upstream. At some point, whether by curiosity or navigation error, they wandered into an area known as the Maze. The name was apt. The maze consisted of a complex tangle of passages, interconnecting in ways that could confuse even experienced cave explorers. It was here, deep in the maze, that disaster struck. One by one, the flashlights began to fail. Batteries died, bulbs dimmed and went dark. The teenagers found themselves in a situation that every spelunker dreads, losing light in an underground environment where darkness is absolute. They checked their equipment desperately. How many lights still worked? The answer was devastating. 2. Out of 8 people, only 2 flashlights still functioned, and they had no backup lights. The group made a decision born of desperation. 2 of them, presumably those whose lights still worked, would continue forward, trying to find a way out or reach a known landmark where they could get help. The other 6 would stay put in the maze, conserving the little light they had left, waiting for rescue. The pair with functioning flashlights moved through the cave system with purpose. They navigated through the maze, descended Skid Row, climbed up Jones Canyon, passed through the breezeway, traversed the left-hand passage, entered the Handley room, ascended Handley's silo, and finally reached the sand floor room. Having traveled this far into the system, they retraced their route to the Handley room, where they knew a cave register was located. Cave registers, logbooks where cave explorers sign in and out, recording their routes and expected exit times, serve as crucial safety tools. The pair settled in near the register to wait. At least if rescuers came looking, they'd likely check the register and find them there. Back in the maze, the remaining 6 faced a deteriorating situation. They had managed to keep one light working, a cigarette lighter. The small flame provided minimal illumination, just enough to see each other's faces in the darkness, just enough to maintain some psychological connection to the visible world. But a lighter provides no real light for navigation, and its fuel wouldn't last indefinitely. The temperature in the cave remained constant year-round, somewhere in the low to mid-50s Fahrenheit, about 12 to 14 degrees Celsius. On the surface, that might seem mild, but underground that temperature becomes dangerously cold. One member of the group faced an additional crisis. He was diabetic, and as hours passed without food, his blood sugar levels began to drop. The symptoms started subtly, slight dizziness, difficulty concentrating, but gradually worsened. In the cold and darkness, with no way to properly manage his condition, he grew increasingly woozy. His companions could do nothing but stay with him, monitor him through touch and voice in the darkness, and hope rescue would arrive before his condition became critical. Time lost all meaning in the absolute darkness. Minutes felt like hours. Hours stretched endlessly. The group had no way to track time passing. They could only sit in the cold, in the dark, listening to each other's breathing, feeling the damp stone around them, wondering if anyone had realized they were missing yet, wondering if help was coming, wondering if they would die here. Sunday evening arrived on the surface, and the 8 teenagers failed to emerge from the cave. Realizing something was wrong, their family members and friends summoned help. Jerry Kyle received the notification Sunday night. Kyle was an experienced explorer familiar with Oregon Cave's complex layout. He quickly assembled 2 other volunteers, and the 3 of them entered the cave to conduct a search. They had a significant advantage. They knew the cave system and could make educated guesses about where lost cave explorers might end up. The maze was the obvious place to check first. It was a known problem area where people could become disoriented. Kyle and his team made their way to the maze and began searching. In the darkness, they called out, listening for responses. Eventually, their lights illuminated 6 figures huddled together in the passage. When the rescuers' lights appeared, the relief must have been overwhelming. They were found. They would get out. The nightmare was ending. But the nightmare wasn't over for everyone. The rescuers quickly assessed the situation. 6 cave explorers accounted for, but the group had entered as 8. Where were the other 2? The 6 explained that 2 had left with working flashlights, trying to find help or reach a known area, but they had no idea exactly where those 2 had gone or how far they had traveled into the cave system. The maze was just the starting point. From there, dozens of passages led in different directions, and without knowing the pair's route, searching became exponentially more difficult. Kyle and his team got the 6 moving toward the exit. The diabetic member was woozy, but able to walk with assistance. After hours in the cold, all 6 were hypothermic to varying degrees, shivering, stiff, exhausted, but mobile. The rescuers guided them through the passages they had been unable to navigate in darkness, back toward the lip's entrance and the surface. Once the 6 were safely out, Kyle and his team exited to regroup and call for additional manpower. 2 people were still missing somewhere in the extensive cave system, and finding them would require expanded search effort. Additional volunteers assembled quickly. The caving community responds rapidly to emergencies. A coordinated plan was developed. 4 rescuers would return to the lips area to continue searching passages accessible from that entrance, while 4 more would enter through the main commercial entrance to search the organ lips connection, the passages that linked different sections of the cave system. The second team, entering through the commercial entrance, moved systematically through the passages and checking likely locations where lost cave explorers might end up. They worked their way through the connection passages, calling out, listening, shining lights into side passages and chambers. In the Handley room area, they finally found them. The 2 teenagers had spent the entire night underground. Unlike their 6 companions, who had at least stayed together in the maze, this pair had traveled deep into the cave system before settling near the register to wait. The cold had been relentless. The cave temperature that feels cool during an active caving trip becomes agonizing when you're sitting still for hours. Hypothermia had set in gradually, the shivering that eventually stops as the body's core temperature drops, the mental fog, the desperate need for warmth. In their desperation, they had done something that made the rescuers' hearts sink. They had burned the cave register, the logbook that served as a safety tool for all cave explorers who visited this section of the cave. The register that documented who had been here and when had been torn apart and set alight, its pages consumed to provide brief moments of heat and light. The rescuers found them huddled near the remains of the fire, traumatized by their overnight ordeal, suffering from exposure, but alive. They were guided out through the passages, finally emerging into daylight around 10 a.m. Monday morning, approximately 24 hours after they had entered the cave on Sunday afternoon, the 8 teenagers had entered Organ Cave expecting an afternoon of exploration. Instead, 6 of them spent hours trapped in darkness with only a cigarette lighter, slowly freezing, one of them sliding toward diabetic crisis. 2 others spent an entire night deep in the cave system, so desperate for warmth that they destroyed a safety register to burn for heat. All 8 emerged alive, but traumatized by an experience that should never have happened. The cause wasn't a cave collapse or a flood or getting lost in Virgin Passage. The cause was simple: preventable negligence. They had entered an extensive cave system without adequate backup lights. The 8 teenagers had violated this fundamental rule, and the consequences had nearly proved fatal. Monday morning, the cave would forever represent something different. A place where darkness became absolute, where cold seeped into your bones, where hours stretched into eternity, and where the simple failure to pack backup flashlights nearly cost them their lives. On August 11th, 1979, in the humid backwoods of Tennessee, a group of young individuals arrived at a place that locals regarded with a quiet kind of respect. Not fear, not superstition. Just that sober acknowledgement people give to wilderness places that have already proven what they are capable of. That place was Wildman Cove Cave. From the outside, it didn't look like much. Just another opening in the limestone country that stretches through the Volunteer State, an angled pit in the earth, framed by wet moss, ferns, and the sharp smell of underground air pushing upward like a slow exhale. But this cave had a reputation that seasoned explorers knew well. Wildman Cove wasn't a tourist cave, or a family cave, or an easy Sunday afternoon crawl. It was deep, steep, narrow, and technical. The kind of cave where the earth feels alive and close, almost aware of your presence. And waiting at the entrance of it that hot August afternoon was a 111-foot entrance pit. Most of that pit was a vertical freefall space, but the final stretch, the last part of the descent, was a narrow stone slot, a squeeze that angled just enough to press one member closer to the rock, close enough that anything on your body could brush the gear that kept you alive. Clothing, backpacks, straps, hair, especially hair. That afternoon, among the group gearing up at the rim of the entrance, was 14-year-old Jonathan Hogue. He was young, enthusiastic, and had already been on several caving trips. This was not his first rappel. He was confident, maybe a little too confident. He had long hair, dark, thick, hanging past his shoulders, and even though older spelunkers had warned him multiple times to tie it back before descending this pit, he hadn't done it. He'd never caught it in a rappel rack before, so in his mind, the risk didn't feel real. While the adults organized gear and checked one another's setups, Jonathan stepped to the top of the pit with the excitement. He clipped into his rope, grabbed his rappel rack, tested his weight, and began his descent. The sunlight above him shrank rapidly as he lowered himself into the cool darkness of the vertical shaft. For the first 40 or 50 feet, the rappel was smooth. The pit was wide, clean, and perfectly vertical. You could almost relax there, suspended above a black void, feeling the stone temperature drop steadily around you. But at around the halfway point, the cave began tightening. The walls started to close in, narrowing around the rope. Jonathan kept descending. Below him, the group already at the bottom of the pit watched his progress by the small circle of light drifting downward. They could see he was entering the angled slot near the bottom, the part everyone had been warned about, the part where you had to be careful, slow, deliberate. Jonathan didn't slow down. He was doing what he believed was a quick rappel, sliding smoothly, confident in his movement, enjoying the ride. And then, without warning, the cave reached out and grabbed him. It happened in a fraction of a second. One moment he was rappelling, the next he was jerked to a violent stop, pinned in place. He didn't fall, he didn't swing, he just stopped. At first, the group at the bottom thought he had intentionally locked off his rack, but something was wrong. His body twisted, his arms were bent awkwardly, and his head was angled sharply against the rack in front of him. Then they realized his long hair had become snagged in the metal bars of his rappel rack. And not just a few strands. A massive clump of hair had wrapped around the bars as they spun under friction, pulling his head tightly into the device. Jonathan was now suspended 50+ feet off the floor, barely able to move. His head was pinned painfully against cold metal. The rope was loaded. His weight kept the rack pressed firmly to his skull. He was trapped. Above him was daylight. Below him was the anxious rising panic of everyone watching. But inside that narrow slot, he had no light, no leverage, and no way to free himself on his own. For a few seconds, nobody moved. Wildman Cove Cave was dead silent, except for the sound of Jonathan's breathing echoing off the stone. There was no dialogue, only that heavy, stifling realization that the cave had just taken control. Hair entanglement in a rappel rack is one of caving's worst nightmares. There's no slack to work with, no easy way to reverse the device, no way to move without tightening the knot of hair further. And the longer the person hangs, the more dangerous it becomes. From the floor, the group could see Jonathan struggling. He tried shifting his shoulders, tried pushing away from the wall, tried turning his head, but every motion only tightened the imprisoning twist of hair. His breathing became rapid. His legs shook with the strain. The rope trembled under his weight. Someone below yelled for a knife. Another dug through a pack. Someone else scrambled for spare gear. Everything was happening at once, but none of it could reach him unless someone climbed up. But this was the bottom of a narrow 111-foot entrance pit. Ascending to him wasn't quick or simple, and every second Jonathan hung there, he was losing strength. Eventually, one of the adults below realized they didn't need to send a rescuer up. They needed to get Jonathan a tool. They tied a knife to the end of a rope, then they tossed the rope upward. Jonathan's shaking hands reached out. He grabbed the rope, untied the knife, and brought it toward his head. His voice, tight, scared, muffled from being pressed against the rack, was briefly heard saying he understood what had to be done. And then he fell silent again. From below, the group could only wait and listen. Suspended in midair, Jonathan raised the knife toward his tangled hair. He was upside down relative to the rack, twisted awkwardly, pinned against the device in a way that made even simple movements exhausting. But he began cutting. He couldn't see the entanglement. He could barely angle his hand properly. He was slicing blind into pain, metal, darkness, and hair. Below him, the others watched in terrified stillness. They could see tiny flecks dropping from above, strands of hair fluttering down like falling ash. Then they saw something else fall, something darker, thicker, blood. Jonathan had accidentally cut his own scalp. The pain must have been instant and severe, but he kept sawing. He had no choice. His only way out of that trap was to remove the entire clump of hair binding him to the rack, even if that meant slicing into his own skin. He kept cutting, and cutting, and cutting. At one point, his body shook so violently that the rope oscillated, sending dust raining down from the stone ceiling. The group below thought he might pass out from blood loss or shock, but somehow, through pain, fear, and sheer survival instinct, he continued working the blade. Suddenly, there was a sharp motion, a snap, a flinch of his entire body. His hair finally tore free from the rack. Jonathan's body swung slightly as his head jerked back, finally liberated. A visible spray of blood flicked off into the darkness. The cut was deep, painful, and messy, but he was no longer trapped. He was free. He immediately resumed his rappel, slow now, shaky. One hand pressed to the back of his head, while the other guided the rope. He descended the final few feet and touched the cave floor at last. As soon as Jonathan reached the ground, one of the older members rushed over. This wasn't just any team member. This person happened to be a paramedic. Under the light of headlamps, they quickly assessed the injury. His hair was hacked unevenly, chunks missing. His scalp was sliced open in a raw, jagged line. Blood matted his hair and dripped down his neck. But the wound, while painful, was manageable. They cleaned the area as best they could inside the damp cave environment. Applied pressure, bandaged it carefully to stop further bleeding. Jonathan was pale, drained, trembling with delayed shock, but conscious and coherent. He wanted to get out. He wanted to climb. He wasn't going to wait any longer than necessary. The group began preparing for the ascent. It wouldn't be quick. Ascending a 111-foot pit is tiring under normal circumstances. Ascending after losing blood and enduring extreme stress is far worse. But the team rallied around him. They rigged the rope. They supported him physically. They watched for signs of fainting or instability. Step by slow step, they helped him rise back toward daylight. The narrow slot that had trapped him now scraped against his gear and shoulders as he inched upward. The blood-soaked bandage occasionally brushed stone, leaving faint red smudges on the limestone. But he kept moving. When he finally reached the lip of the pit, the midday sun hit his eyes. He crawled onto the forest floor like someone emerging from a nightmare. From there, he was taken for further medical treatment at a nearby facility. His wound was cleaned, stitched, and properly dressed. Physically, he would recover. But the memory of hanging helplessly deep underground, his head pinned to a metal device, cutting himself free, would never leave him. Jonathan survived the Wild Man Cove cave incident with only a scalp wound and a permanent reminder of how unforgiving cave systems can be. Later analysis concluded that his long hair, left untied during a quick rappel, had been pulled into his rack by friction, something especially dangerous in tight pits like this one, where bodies press closely against gear. It was a preventable accident, but one that nearly cost him his life. His survival came down to calm thinking, a knife on a rope, and sheer determination. When we talk about underwater cave systems, we often imagine large rooms, clear water, and long tunnels extending into darkness. But the reality is usually the opposite. In many caves across the eastern United States, the most challenging sections are not the large chambers. They're the tight, silt-filled restrictions, where one wrong movement can reduce visibility to zero. And in June of 1992, deep inside the Spout cave system in West Virginia, two veteran divers would be reminded of just how fragile the boundary is between exploration and disaster. The Spout cave system is one of the most complicated cave networks in West Virginia. It is a system shaped by water flow, breakdown collapse, and thousands of years of slow carving through limestone. Unlike many well-known diving caves, the sections explored in this system are not wide underwater tunnels. Instead, they are narrow, low-ceilinged leads filled with fine sediment. The system connects Spout Cave with Harma Cave, forming a multi-layered environment where water rises and falls through seasonal changes. For years, explorers tried to piece together how these two caves interacted, and by the time June arrived, the effort had been going on for nearly 16 months. The divers responsible for this ongoing exploration were Bob Flenner and Dave Cheney. Over more than a year, they worked systematically, locating submerged leads, clearing debris, mapping flooded passages, and pushing deeper into unexplored sections. Their ultimate goal was to find the underwater connection they believed led toward Harma Cave. On this particular trip, they were returning to a small, promising side passage, a narrow lead that looked like it might finally push into new ground. Visibility that day was surprisingly good, about 6 feet, which is generous for this system. They placed a light at the start of the sump, a technique used to help mark orientation and provide a visual anchor during exit, and then they entered the water. The entry section went smoothly. They followed their established guideline, a thin, durable line fixed during earlier dives that created a continuous physical path back to safety. In cave diving, the guideline is everything. If visibility disappears, if silt fills the water, if lights fail, the line becomes the diver's only way home. It provides direction, orientation, and most importantly, certainty. As Flenner and Cheney progressed into the system, the water remained clear enough to relax. They knew the route well. They had done this dozens of times. The only new challenge was the final lead, a narrower, still silty pocket of passage they hoped would open into something larger. They reached it, examined it, and then one after the other entered the lead. That's when the visibility changed. As soon as their bodies displaced the water in the lead, the fine sediment along the floor and walls lifted into suspension. The ceiling was low, the floor was soft, and the water flow was minimal. The perfect environment for a silt-out. Within seconds, visibility dropped from 6 feet to almost nothing. The silt rose and traveled with them, creating a moving cloud behind their fins. But initially, things weren't critical. They could still make out shapes, they could still orient themselves, and they could still see each other's lights as faint glows in the haze. They pressed on a little further, hoping the lead would widen, and it did. Visibility improved again, rising back to around 6 feet. But the moment of relief didn't last. Cheney, who was swimming last, suddenly realized something was wrong. The guideline had looped and caught around part of his gear. In a tight passage, entanglement is one of the most dangerous failure points possible. A diver who cannot move backward or forward loses the ability to adjust position, and every motion risks further disturbing the silt. Cheney signaled to Flenner with his light. Flenner immediately turned back, saw the issue, and carefully freed the line. This entire process took seconds, but behind them, the suspended silt cloud they had stirred inside, the restriction was now catching up. They both saw it. A thick rolling fog of zero visibility water was slowly consuming the passage they had just passed through. They didn't need to communicate. They both knew what this meant. They signaled the same message at the same time: abort the dive. They turned around, and the moment they did, Visibility collapsed completely, from 1 foot to nothing. Their lights illuminated nothing but a solid brown curtain. The world reduced to touch only. The line, now the only reference, was the lifeline between them and the exit. Cheney went first, Flanner followed. They moved slowly, carefully running their hands along the guideline, staying low to avoid worsening the silt. They knew that every second counted. Silt could linger in this system for hours. A total blackout in a tight cave is one of the most stressful situations a diver can experience. As they moved, both men were fully dependent on the guideline, feeling each knot, each tension change, each direction shift. Their lights were useless. The cave had become a featureless void. And then, the real problem arrived. As Flanner approached what should have been the exit restriction, the narrow opening leading back to the main sump, he reached out and touched solid rock. He didn't find an opening. He didn't find the familiar squeeze. He didn't feel the space he had entered earlier. Just a wall everywhere. He swept his hand to the left. Rock. He moved it upward. Rock. He checked the right side. Still rock. The exit had vanished. Cheney had already exited the restriction and was now on the other side. He stayed at the exact location where he expected Flanner to emerge and shone his light toward the passage, hoping it might cut through the blackout. It didn't. All Flanner saw was darkness. He realized the problem almost instantly. The guideline had slipped into a fissure. During the silt-out, the line had likely pulled into a tiny crack or seam in the rock, small enough for a guideline, but far too small for a diver with tanks. To anyone in zero visibility, the line would still feel correct, still feel taut, still feel directional, but it was leading him into stone. Flanner pressed his face to the rock and began working the line down, feeling for the true path. A few inches, a few more, and then the line dropped into the correct contour. He followed it forward, and his tanks hit rock again. Too tight. He wasn't fitting through. The restriction felt narrower than when he entered, but this was a psychological illusion. The space was the same. The only difference was that without sight, the brain magnified every point of contact. He forced himself to stay calm. He exhaled to compress his chest. He angled his body, and then he lunged forward. In a single committed motion, he pushed through the restriction, and suddenly, the water opened up around him. He had made it. With the restriction behind him, the remaining 80 feet back to the start of the sump were straightforward. The silt was still present, but the passage was wider and the guideline was clear. Moments later, both men surfaced. There was no celebration, no extended debrief, just the quiet recognition of how close they had come to becoming stuck inside a cave with zero visibility and no exit. They had spent 16 months defining the system. On this dive, the system had defined its limits. Right then, they made the same decision. They were done with cave diving. After over a year of slow, deliberate progress through the Spout Harma network, the June silt-out was the event that ended their exploration career. Like many diving incidents, nothing happened because of panic. Nothing happened because someone rushed. Nothing happened because someone made a reckless choice. This was simply the intersection of narrow geometry, loose silt, limited visibility guideline movement, and the inherent risk of underwater caves. In underwater caves, the margin is always thin, and in Spout Cave, it closed in just a few seconds. June 11th, 1988. 4 divers arrived at Blue Springs in Madison County, Florida, on a Saturday morning that promised perfect conditions for diving. The spring's crystal clear water maintained a constant 72 degrees Fahrenheit, 22 degrees Celsius, temperature year-round, with visibility that could exceed 100 feet, 30 meters, on good days. For the 3 U.S. Navy personnel and the teenage son of one of them, it seemed like an ideal location for underwater exploration. They had standard open water scuba certifications, the basic training that allows recreational divers to explore reefs, shipwrecks, and other open water environments down to depths around 60 feet, 18 meters. Their equipment reflected this training level: standard scuba tanks, basic regulators, weight belts, and minimal lights. Small flashlights suitable for looking into shadows during daylight dives, but inadequate for extended exploration in dark environments. What they lacked was cave diving certification. They entered Blue Springs as competent open water divers venturing into an environment for which they were completely unprepared. Blue Springs flows from a limestone aquifer, its water emerging through underwater passages that extend deep into the Florida bedrock. The spring's entrance opens into a large chamber called the Horseshoe Room, a spacious area where sunlight penetrates the clear water, creating an otherworldly blue glow that attracts divers from around the world. This is the daylight zone, the area where ambient light from the surface still provides illumination, where the ceiling seems less oppressive, where escape to the surface remains visually obvious. But the Horseshoe Room is merely the entrance to a much larger system. Various passages lead from this chamber into True Cave, areas where no natural light penetrates, where the only illumination comes from divers' lights, where becoming disoriented means becoming lost in absolute darkness with no obvious route to the surface. The four divers descended into the Horseshoe Room, the sunlight filtering through the water, creating dancing patterns on the limestone walls. The chamber was impressive, large enough to make you forget you were inside a cave. They explored the walls, the rocky ledges, the various features that made this space so visually stunning. Then they found the ledge that led down into the cross-under tunnel. The cross-under tunnel represented a threshold. Beyond this point, natural light faded rapidly. Beyond this point, navigation required either extensive knowledge of the cave layout or strict adherence to permanent guidelines that cave divers had installed for safe passage. Beyond this point, the margin for error disappeared entirely. 3 of the 4 divers, the teenagers staying behind in the Horseshoe Room, entered the tunnel. Their minimal lights pushed back the darkness just enough to reveal the passage ahead. The tunnel extended into blackness, a limestone tube carved by water over millennia, its walls and floor covered with fine silt that had settled there over decades. They finned forward, their movements stirring the silt. In caves with minimal water flow, each fin kick and each motion near the floor or walls sent clouds of fine particles billowing into the water column. The silt hung suspended, reducing visibility from tens of feet to inches within seconds. The 3 divers proceeded approximately 350 feet, 107 meters, into the cross-under tunnel, far enough that the entrance was no longer visible, even without the silt-out conditions they had created. They had no formal cave training, no understanding of proper finning techniques that minimize silt disturbance, no knowledge of how to navigate in zero visibility. They moved deeper into a passage that was becoming progressively more dangerous with each movement. Around the 350-foot mark, disorientation set in. The silt they stirred now obscured everything. Their minimal lights penetrated only inches through the murky water. Without adequate illumination, without training in touch contact and guideline following, without the ability to navigate by feel alone, they lost all sense of direction. In a cave, there is no up that leads to safety. Every direction looked the same in the silt-out. Brown murk pressing in from all sides, no visible landmarks, no way to distinguish the way out from the way deeper into the system. Their breathing rates increased as they attempted to find their way out, consuming their air supplies more rapidly. The divers became separated in the confusion, each moving independently as they attempted to locate the exit. Visibility was so poor that they could pass within feet of each other without seeing a silhouette or a glow of a light. One of the 3 managed to navigate back toward the daylight zone, whether through slightly clearer water along the path he chose, or through finding a familiar contour. He reached the Horseshoe Room where the teenager waited. 2 divers remained lost in the murky darkness of the cross-under tunnel. The 2 who were lost found a jump line, a temporary guideline installed by cave divers to mark a route from the main permanent line to a side passage. Jump lines are standard practice in cave diving, but they require proper training to use safely. Without that training, the divers could not determine which direction led back to the main exit corridor. They followed the jump line and reached the main permanent guideline. Disoriented and unable to identify the correct direction along the line, they moved the wrong way, their air supplies depleted as they continued searching for the exit. Standard recreational scuba tanks hold between 2,400 and 3,000 psi, approximately 80 cubic feet, 2,265 liters, of compressed air. At depth, under stress, and breathing heavily, these tanks can be emptied in 15 to 20 minutes or less. The first diver reached the red zone, 500 psi or below. Moments later, his tank emptied. In a cave 350 feet from the entrance with zero visibility, there was no emergency ascent option. When he drew on his regulator and received no air, his final minutes unfolded in the unforgiving conditions of a silted-out cave tunnel. He drowned, unable to reach the entrance or a source of breathable air. The second diver remained alive moments longer. He attempted to continue along the guideline, but his air supply reached zero as well. He drowned in the same dark passage, his body settling in the silt-filled water. In the horseshoe room, the surviving father and son realized the two missing divers were not returning. One body was visible at the entrance to the cross-under tunnel. They attempted to recover him and succeeded in bringing one drowned diver back to the horseshoe room. The other remained lost somewhere deeper in the tunnel system, beyond their ability to retrieve without cave diving training or equipment. Approximately 30 minutes after the drownings, two certified cave divers emerged from the upstream main tunnel, completing their own exploration dive. As they swam across the horseshoe room, they noticed a scuba tank on the floor near the mouth of the cross-under tunnel. The position of the tank indicated a problem. They searched the area and found the second drowned diver near the ceiling of the passage, his body suspended in the gentle current. They recovered the body and brought it to the horseshoe room. The Saturday dive at Blue Springs had turned from recreation to tragedy. Two men had drowned less than 400 feet, 122 meters from the entrance, in a passage routinely navigated by trained cave divers. They died not from equipment failure or extreme conditions, but from a chain of errors created by entering a cave without training. The investigation identified each link in that chain: entering a cave without certification, using inadequate lights, disturbing silt due to improper finning techniques, failing to understand guidelines, following a jump line incorrectly, and running out of air while lost in complete darkness. The two survivors left Blue Springs traumatized. The father had watched his companions drown and helped recover their bodies. The teenager had waited in the horseshoe room, unsure whether his father would return, and witnessing the aftermath unfold around him. The two drowned Navy personnel joined the grim statistics of cave diving fatalities, overwhelmingly composed of untrained divers who entered caves with open water certifications and standard equipment. Blue Springs became another example of a place where curiosity beyond the daylight zone extended 350 feet into darkness and ended in drowning. A place where minimal lights, standard gear, and recreational training proved fatally insufficient for an environment that demanded respect, specialized equipment, and the training required to survive in a world without daylight. The cave near Purdy, Alabama, did not announce itself as dangerous. From the outside, it looked like countless other caves scattered across the region, an unassuming opening in the rock, partially hidden by vegetation, offering no hint of complexity beyond its entrance. There were no warning signs, no gates, no obvious indication that once inside, orientation could vanish completely. To someone without experience, it felt approachable, familiar, safe. On the morning of Monday, August 8, 1977, two teenagers stepped inside without hesitation. Scott Mitchell and Ken Grund were both 15 years old. They were not members of a caving organization. They had no guide, no map, no formal plan. What they had was curiosity, confidence, and the belief that caves were places you explored casually and exited the same way you entered. At first, the cave rewarded that belief. They moved through the main passage easily. It was wide enough to walk upright, with a ceiling high enough to forget it was there at all. The floor sloped gently, broken only by scattered rocks and shallow mud patches. Their flashlights illuminated familiar cave textures, rough limestone walls, small formations, damp surfaces reflecting light back at them. Sound behaved predictably. Footsteps echoed clearly, movement felt controlled, nothing suggested danger. As they continued deeper, they noticed bats hanging from the ceiling ahead. Dark clusters clung to the rock, barely distinguishable from shadows. Instead of backing away, the boys treated the moment like a distraction. They scooped up mud from the floor and began throwing it upward. The mud balls struck the ceiling and burst apart, sending droplets in every direction. The bats reacted instantly. They scattered in a sudden rush of wings, filling the passage with movement and sound before disappearing deeper into the cave. Excited, the boys followed, chasing the disturbance without slowing down or thinking about direction. In that moment, they stopped navigating and started reacting. Turns were taken without consideration. Junctions were passed without note. Distinctive features that could have anchored memory were ignored completely. By the time the bats were gone, the cave no longer felt the same. The main passage had subtly fractured into multiple options. What had once felt like a single corridor now branched and curved unpredictably. Ceiling height lowered slightly, forcing the boys to duck in places. The floor became more uneven, damp patches turning slick beneath their shoes. Echoes behaved strangely now, bouncing back from unexpected angles, making it harder to tell where space opened or closed. When they finally decided to leave, they turned around expecting familiarity. Instead, they found nothing they recognized. They tried retracing their path, choosing what felt like the correct direction, but the passage behind them did not match their memory. Junctions appeared where they were sure none had existed. Openings branched off at angles that all looked equally plausible. Each step forward increased uncertainty rather than resolving it. The cave was far more complex than they had realized. They moved slowly now, stopping often, trying to reason their way back. But reasoning underground without landmarks quickly collapses. Every turn began to look the same. The rock textures blended together. Mud smears erased footprints almost instantly. The longer they searched, the less confident they became. Eventually, the walking passages stopped offering options. The larger routes either looped back into confusion or narrowed into smaller openings. Faced with the reality that standing passages were no longer leading anywhere useful, the boys made a critical decision. They entered a crawlway. The crawlway was low and tight, forcing them onto their hands and knees almost immediately. The ceiling pressed close enough to eliminate standing entirely, and even crouching became impossible within a few feet. Forward movement required crawling, dragging knees and elbows through mud and shallow water, shoulders brushing rock on both sides. They chose the crawlway for a simple reason. It looked used. The rock was worn smooth. The floor showed signs of traffic. In caves, worn surfaces often suggest routes that connect major passages. To the boys, it seemed logical that this crawlway would eventually reconnect with the main passage or lead toward an exit. Instead, it led them deeper into confusion. The crawlway twisted gently, then steepened, sloping downward just enough to remove any sense of direction. Left and right lost meaning as their bodies aligned with the passage rather than the world above. Their flashlights illuminated only a few feet ahead, flattening depth and erasing perspective. Then the crawlway branched. They chose one direction and crawled for several minutes, muscles already beginning to ache from the unnatural posture. The passage narrowed further before abruptly ending in solid rock. They reversed course, marking the wall as best they could, and tried another branch. That one ended too, then another and another. Each attempt cost them time and strength. Crawling is far more exhausting than walking. Every movement requires lifting and dragging body weight against gravity and friction. Knees slammed into stone, elbows scraped raw, clothing soaked up mud and water, becoming heavier with every minute. Breathing grew labored, not from fear, but from physical exertion. They tried to stay systematic. They marked each dead end, trying to avoid repeating mistakes. But the markings blurred together, mud smeared across walls, fatigue dulled memory. What had once seemed clear quickly became meaningless. Every branch began to look identical. Hours passed. The crawl space became their entire world. There was no standing, no stretching, no relief, only forward, backward, and the constant pressure of stone above their backs. Time lost definition. Hunger and thirst set in quietly. Knees throbbed, wrists burned. Every decision required effort. Then one flashlight went out. The darkness changed immediately. One beam meant one fragile point of reference. Depth perception vanished entirely. The remaining flashlight was already weak, its batteries fading, the beam growing shorter and yellower with each passing minute. Shadows thickened, corners swallowed light completely. Panic did not arrive suddenly. It crept in slowly, disguised as exhaustion. By late afternoon, the boys were physically spent. Crawling had drained them in a way they had never experienced before. At around 6 p.m., after nearly 8 hours underground, they accepted that continuing to move was no longer possible. They chose a spot slightly elevated above pooled water and lay down, their bodies pressed into cold mud and stone. The cave was silent except for distant water. Sleep came not from comfort, but from depletion. Sometime later, something changed. A sound reached them, faint at first, distorted by echoes and distance. It did not sound like water. It did not sound like movement from the cave itself. It was human. At first, they could not tell where it came from. The cave twisted sound unpredictably, making direction meaningless. But the realization alone, another person nearby, cut through the fatigue like electricity. With effort, they made noise. Any noise they could manage. Eventually, contact was made. They had been found by chance. A Sunday school outing group was exploring a different section of the cave entirely. Their presence was not planned. It was coincidence, paths intersecting underground without warning. Slowly and carefully, the group made their way to the boys' position and guided them out, retracing a route that now seemed obvious but had been invisible from inside the crawl space. Scott Mitchell and Ken Grund emerged alive. The analysis afterward was simple, direct, and unforgiving, because there was no mystery left to unravel once the facts were laid out. Nothing extraordinary had failed. No hidden collapse had sealed the cave. No sudden flood had cut off escape. What trapped them was a chain of ordinary decisions made without foresight, each one narrowing their margin for error until there was none left. Spur-of-the-moment caving, combined with minimal equipment and no structured plan, had quietly placed them into a system they did not understand and could not mentally map once orientation was lost. The choice to continue deeper while distracted, the failure to mark landmarks, and the assumption that any passage would eventually lead back out, all compounded into a single mistake, treating the cave as a space that would forgive confusion. When they finally realized they were lost, their options were already limited. The crawlway, which appeared at the time to be a reasonable solution, ultimately became the mechanism that locked them in place. Once light began to fail, the outcome was effectively sealed. Without reliable illumination, the cave stopped being navigable altogether. Strength followed quickly, consumed by hours of crawling that offered no progress. At that point, escape no longer depended on decision-making or perseverance. It depended entirely on external intervention. Without rescue, specifically the chance encounter that brought other people into the cave that day, the boys would not have found their way out on their own. What saved them was not preparation, skill, or problem solving. It was coincidence. And underground, coincidence is never something you can rely on. They survive because someone else happened to be there. In caves, that kind of luck is rare, and it does not come twice. September 1987. Prince of Wales Island sat at the northern end of El Capitan Passage in Alaska, a remote wilderness accessible only by boat or float plane. El Capitan Cave, carved through the island's limestone, represented one of Alaska's most extensive cave systems. A phreatic maze formed when the passages were completely water-filled, creating a bewildering network of interconnected tunnels that branched and rejoined without a clear pattern. Carleen Allred and her partner had traveled to this isolated location in August with their 3 young children. They took turns exploring the cave while the other watched the kids on the surface. When Carlene's turn came, she entered alone, her carbide lamp freshly charged and burning bright. She carried backup lighting, a pen light and a Kyloom chemical light stick. She moved through the main passage conducting survey work, measuring distances and compass bearings to document the cave's layout. A side passage branched off from the large main tunnel. She followed it, recording measurements, until it terminated in a small, muddy room. At floor level, she found a crawl half filled with water, barely large enough to squeeze through. A passage she wasn't sure if she should explore or not. Then she felt it. A draft of air moving through the passage. Air movement often indicates continuation, that there's another opening ahead. Dead-end passages have stagnant air. The draft suggested the crawl might lead to an unexplored section of the cave. Excited by the discovery, she decided to push through. She left her pack, spare carbide fuel, and extra equipment in the muddy room. Traveling light would make the tight squeeze easier, and since it's just a quick look inside, she'd be back soon. Carlene entered the water crawl and started making her way forward. Cold water soaked through her clothing as she pulled herself forward on her belly, ceiling pressing against her back, water rising around her face. Mud coated everything. The passage seemed endless, a claustrophobic tube barely wide enough for her shoulders. As she made her way, she noticed that the passage opened into a chamber on the far side. Excitement went through the roof as she realized she had reached a new cave beyond the water crawl. She started exploring it, believing that she might be the first ever person to be here. But in all the excitement, something was wrong, which made the situation worrisome. Her carbide lamp was dimming. The bright white flame was fading to weak yellow. This made no sense. She had recharged it recently at the main passage, and it should have burned strong for hours. She checked the water drip rate. Everything seemed properly adjusted, but the flame continued to weaken. She noticed scuff marks on the muddy floor, evidence that someone had been here before, and she wasn't the first one. It was sort of a relief for her, since, if other explorers had been here, they had presumably found a route back to the main passage, perhaps an easier route than the water crawl. Hence, she decided to follow the scuff marks. The phreatic maze structure created the worst possible navigation environment. Unlike stream caves with obvious directions, these passages were interconnected tunnels of similar size that branched unpredictably. Without careful attention to landmarks, it's easy to lose track of which direction leads back. Carlene followed the scuff marks through passage after passage, her lamp growing dimmer. The flame that had started strong was now barely visible, casting almost no useful light. She began to realize her situation. She was lost in a maze cave, her primary light failing, and she had left her spare carbide back at the water crawl entrance, which she could no longer find. Outside the cave, her partner and their kids were enjoying their time. They were clueless about all the ordeal that was going on inside, unaware that Carlene might never make it out of the cave, and at some point they'd need to contact the authorities. The passages all looked similar in the fading light. Muddy walls, low ceilings, branches leading in multiple directions. The scuff marks that had seemed like clear guidance now appeared in multiple passages. Or perhaps she was seeing marks from different trips overlapping. While trying to find her way back, she came across a muddy wall that was blocking her way. Carlene attempted to climb over that obstacle. As she was on top of it, the muddy wall gave way. She slipped down the incline, her body sliding across the slick surface, unable to stop. Her fingers clawed desperately at the wall. She felt something give way. Sharp, intense pain in her right hand. One of her fingernails caught on a rock projection and peeled back from the nail bed, tearing partially away from the underlying tissue. The pain was immediate and severe. The nail hung loose, blood mixing with mud coating her hands. The exposed nail bed raw and hypersensitive. Every touch sent shocks of pain through her finger. She had no first aid supplies, no way to bandage or protect the injury. She could only cradle the damaged hand and continue searching. Things went back to worse instantly, because then her carbide lamp went out completely. The flame flickered once, twice, and died, leaving her in absolute darkness. The kind of darkness that exists only in caves, where no light penetrates, where holding your hand inches from your face reveals nothing. Carlene fumbled for her penlight in the blackness. Her injured hand made the task difficult, pain shooting through her finger with every movement. She found the small flashlight and activated it. The beam flickered, a weak, intermittent light that worked sporadically at best. Failing batteries or damaged connection created a strobe effect, the light flashing on and off unpredictably. The flickering light was worse than darkness. Each flash briefly illuminated her surroundings, then plunged her back into blackness before her eyes could process what she'd seen. She tried navigating with the flickering penlight, but the unreliable illumination made it nearly impossible to move safely. She couldn't judge distances, couldn't see obstacles clearly, couldn't determine which passages led where. Her last option was the Sialume stick, the chemical light that would provide steady illumination, but with limited duration. Once activated, Sialumes cannot be turned off. They glow for a few hours and then fade. This was her final light source. If she activated it and couldn't find her way out before it faded, she would be trapped in absolute darkness with no remaining options. She had no choice. She bent the plastic tube until it snapped internally, mixing the chemicals. The Sialume brightened, casting eerie green light across the muddy passages. The illumination was weak, just enough to see a few feet ahead, barely sufficient to distinguish passage openings from walls, but it was steady. She could navigate again. Carlene moved through the maze with growing desperation. The Sialume's glow was already beginning to fade. These chemical lights burn brightest immediately after activation and gradually dim over several hours. She had limited time before even this last source would fail. Her injured finger throbbed with every heartbeat, the damaged nail sending constant pain signals. She was wet, muddy, hurt, lost, and running out of light in a maze cave on a remote Alaskan island. If she didn't find her way out soon, she would be trapped here, unable to see, unable to navigate, unable to call for help. Her partner on the surface would eventually realize she'd been gone too long, but how long would that take? Hours? Days? And how would rescuers find her in this maze? She stumbled through passage after passage, the green glow revealing endless muddy tunnels that all looked similar. Then something caught her eye. A flash of color that didn't belong. She moved closer. It was survey tape, the brightly colored flagging tape she had left at the entrance to the original water crawl when she began her survey work. Relief flooded through her. She had found her way back. The hours of wandering lost, the failing lights, the injured finger, the growing panic. It was over. She was at a known location. From here, she could navigate back to the main passage where she had left her gear. Carlene followed the survey tape markers back through the muddy room to the water crawl. The passage that had seemed barely passable now looked like salvation. The route back to her equipment, back to reliable light, back to safety. She entered the crawl, pulling herself through the cold water, the mud, the tight constriction. But this time, she knew where it led. She emerged into the room where she had left her pack. Her spare carbide was there, her fresh batteries, her extra equipment, all waiting where she had left them. She recharged her carbide lamp properly, the strong white flame instantly dispelling the fading green glow of the dying Sialume. With reliable light restored, she made her way back to the main passage and then to the entrance. She emerged from El Capitan Cave hours later than expected, muddy, wet, exhausted, with one fingernail partially torn off, and the mental exhaustion of having been lost in a maze cave with failing light. Her partner and the kids had no idea that inside the cave, she was fighting for her life. On the morning of Sunday, November 30th, 2025, the tiny limestone plains near Tantanoola in South Australia looked harmless, almost boring. A few low trees, open farmland, quiet wind moving across the grass. But beneath that unremarkable patch of dirt was one of the most dangerous underwater mazes on Earth, Tank Cave. 7 kilometers of submerged tunnels, some no wider than a man's shoulders, twisting through the limestone like veins. And on that morning, 65-year-old Gary Gibson, a veteran Victorian cave diver, stood at the metal grate leading down into that world. He wasn't a thrill seeker. He wasn't reckless. He was described by friends as calm, competent, almost methodical. He had dived Tank Cave before. He knew its rules, and he respected them. That morning, he wasn't alone. Two close diving partners, both highly trained, arrived with him. The three of them had spent the previous evening discussing the dive plan, gas management, route selection, the tight sections they planned to explore, and a very specific procedure, a rendezvous point, in case one of them ran into trouble or needed to turn back. It was the kind of plan that comes from experience, and in cave diving, experience is life. Just after 9 a.m., the divers suited up. The sunlight reflected off their cylinders as they pre-checked regulators and lights. Despite the calmness of the preparation, there was always an unspoken truth in the air. No cave diver ever considers a dive routine. Once Gary lowered himself into the water and felt the temperature shock his skin, the entire world shrank into a realm of darkness, coldness, and silence. Tank Cave isn't a welcoming place. The walls are pale, ghost-like. Visibility can vanish instantly with the slightest fin kick, and the tunnels go from roomy to coffin-tight with almost no warning. The team descended, torches slicing through the darkness. For the first few hundred meters, everything went exactly as planned. They followed the main lines, gliding through chambers that ballooned open like underwater cathedrals before squeezing into narrower, twisting passages. Gary moved with quiet precision. His breathing was steady, his buoyancy perfect. For someone who was 65, he handled himself like a man half his age. Their route was supposed to take them toward one of the more constricted sections deeper in the system. The idea wasn't to push the limits, it was simply a familiar exploration. But divers know, Tank Cave never gives you the same dive twice. Around 10 a.m., the team reached the restriction, a squeeze only one diver at a time could attempt. The first diver slipped through without much difficulty. The second diver followed after adjusting his gear slightly to fit. Gary approached next. He angled himself, exhaled to reduce his profile, adjusted his arm, but almost immediately he felt resistance. His chest brushed limestone. His tank scraped lightly. He tried a second time, more carefully, but again he felt the unmistakable pressure of the rock closing in. And that was enough. Gary knew what a mistake in a restriction looked like. Divers stuck, shredding gear, panicking, burning through gas, dying in total darkness. He wasn't going to be that person. He signaled to the others. He wasn't going through. He was turning back. The team acknowledged. They had already discussed this exact scenario during planning. Gary would turn around, follow the guideline back the way they came, and meet them at the rendezvous point, about 150 meters behind them. Everyone was calm. Everything was normal, for the moment. He began retreating through the tunnel system alone. His torch beam jittered across the pale walls. The water around him was still. His bubbles drifted upward and disappeared into the darkness above. But Tank Cave is like a living thing. A single hand movement can stir the silt. A single misplaced fin kick can create a blizzard of suspended particles that swallow visibility in seconds. And somewhere on his way back, although no one will ever know exactly why, something changed. Maybe Gary brushed the floor with a fin. Maybe the movement of his body disturbed the powdery sediment in a side crack. Or maybe he entered a section where the visibility was already borderline. Either way, the world around him clouded. The white limestone walls vanished. The line in front of him faded into a gray haze. A silt-out. Every cave diver's nightmare. Gary knew how to handle it. He was trained. You stop. You breathe slower. You maintain contact with the guideline. You orient yourself. You don't rush. But stress does not ask permission. The water was cold. His breathing might have quickened. He may have kicked harder, unknowingly stirring more silt. And in Tank Cave, panic doesn't look like screaming. It looks like breathing slightly faster, narrowing your focus, forgetting a step, just enough to send your situation spiraling. Back at the restriction, the other two divers pushed through the passage, completed their planned turnaround, and began heading back to meet Gary. They were expecting to see his light flicker toward them at any moment, but when they reached the rendezvous point, the space was empty. No Gary, just darkness. At first, they weren't worried. Divers get delayed. Maybe he had paused somewhere, adjusting gear. Maybe he was drifting slower than usual. But minutes passed, and in underwater time, where seconds matter, that was too long. A bad feeling crept in. They swam back the way they came, scanning the tunnels, and then, deep in the murky distance, they saw it. A faint glow, a dive light. Relief surged. They kicked toward it fast, but when they reached the source of the light, the relief evaporated instantly. Gary was there, floating motionless in the water, unmoving, not breathing, not responding. The two divers tried to initiate rescue procedures, but it was too late. They couldn't bring him back. They had no choice but to surface and call for help. When police and emergency services received the call, diver missing in Tank Cave, they knew instantly this was not a simple operation. Tank Cave is notorious. Rescues here are brutal. Recoveries are brutal. Everything is brutal. By the afternoon, media outlets were already reporting that a diver was missing in one of Australia's most dangerous cave systems. Photos of the cave entrance circulated online. Neighbors gathered near the property line, whispering. Within hours, it became the talk of the region. Authorities began describing publicly how complex Tank Cave was, how narrow, how cold, how treacherous, emphasizing that extracting a body from such a place wasn't a matter of sending one or two divers down. It required specialists. And by Monday morning, the specialists had arrived. A team of 10 expert divers, including members of the Cave Divers Association of Australia and the state's Police Water Operations Unit, suited up at the entrance. Among them was Dr. Richard Harris, the highly respected cave diver who helped lead the Thai cave rescue years earlier. The same man who had recovered bodies from this very cave before. If he was here, the situation was serious. The recovery mission took 3 separate dives. The divers fought through freezing water, tight squeezes that scraped tanks, zero visibility tunnels that forced them to feel their way forward by fingertips alone. This wasn't just technical diving. It was crawling underwater through stone. Authorities would later describe the environment as relentlessly hostile, a place where even the most trained diver could become trapped, disoriented, or exhausted. After nearly 24 hours of effort, around 3:30 p.m. on Monday, Gary's body was finally brought to the surface. The divers emerged one by one, exhausted and shaken. The area fell into a heavy silence. Media headlines lit up instantly. Experienced diver dies in Tank Cave. Police confirmed the death publicly. They explained that there was no evidence of entanglement, rock collapse, or suspicious circumstances. They emphasized how dangerous the environment was. They clarified that a full coroner's investigation would take place. Unlike previous tragedies, this one left behind a strange emptiness of explanation. Gary did not get stuck. His equipment did not fail. There was no collapse, no entanglement, no sign of struggle. He simply didn't make it back. With that, we understand the gruesome reality. Cave diving doesn't forgive. Not experience, not confidence, not preparation, not even perfection. It only takes a moment, one breath too fast, one turn too late, one cloud of silt, and the cave stops being a place you explore. It becomes the last place you ever see. Gary Gibson's final dive at Tank Cave wasn't dramatic. It wasn't reckless. It wasn't the result of bad decisions. It was a quiet tragedy, the kind that sends a chill down the spine of every diver who has ever slipped beneath dark water and followed a thin white guideline into the earth, because they know what happened to Gary could happen to anyone. February 2nd, 2005, Tom Gilliland, Pete Fine, and Bruce Lynn drove 90 minutes from Tucson to explore Waterman Mountain Bat Cave, a recently discovered cave in the Arizona desert. They parked at the base and began organizing their gear. While Fine and Lynn readied their equipment, Gilliland decided to hike up ahead. The approach was only a few hundred yards, but gained about 200 feet, 61 meters of elevation. The limestone was razor sharp, cacti dotted the slope, and sparse brush offered no handholds. Gilliland picked his way up carefully, breathing hard in the dry air. He crossed a ridge and the cave entrance came into view. A dark opening in the limestone face, large enough to walk through. Gilliland reached the entrance and stepped inside, letting his eyes adjust to the dimness. The temperature dropped immediately. The cave's constant cool air, a relief from the desert heat. He moved deeper into the entrance passage. The floor rose ahead, where loose rocks had accumulated, creating a small climb about 3 to 4 feet, 0.9 to 1.2 meters high. To continue deeper into the cave, he'd need to navigate past these rocks. Gilliland began climbing up the loose rock pile. The rocks shifted slightly under his weight, but held. As he reached the top of the climb, he noticed some rocks were particularly loose and protruding awkwardly. Without thinking much about it, he decided to move them aside, perhaps to make the passage easier for Fine and Lynn when they arrived, or simply because they seemed in the way. He grabbed one of the rocks and pulled it away from the pile. Behind the rocks, hidden in a shadowed recess, was a massive hive of Africanized honeybees. The response was instantaneous. A swarm erupted from behind the disturbed rocks, thousands of bees pouring out in a dark, buzzing cloud. The sound was overwhelming, drowning out everything else. Within seconds, the first stings hit. Africanized bees don't sting once and retreat. They attack in mass, targeting any perceived threat to their colony. Dozens of stings hit Gilliland's face, neck, and arms. The pain was intense and immediate, sharp burning sensations multiplying across his skin. Gilliland scrambled backward off the rock pile and ran for the entrance. The swarm pursued. He burst out of the cave and ran back over the ridge, the bees following relentlessly. Killer bees are notorious for chasing threats for hundreds of yards, sometimes over a quarter mile. He ran down the slope, suffering more stings as the swarm kept pace. After about 50 yards, 46 meters, the terrain forced him to navigate a climb down at a ledge. It wasn't a sheer drop, but it required controlled movement, careful foot and hand placement. The kind of climbing where you need to think about each move. Gilliland had no time to think. The bees were still attacking, still stinging. He was stung again at the ledge, the pain and panic overwhelming any careful consideration of the terrain. He attempted to run down the climb down, trying to maintain speed despite the technical nature of the descent. It was a catastrophic mistake. His foot slipped on the sharp limestone. His balance failed. Suddenly he was tumbling, his body careening off the razor-sharp rocks, completely out of control. The fall lasted only seconds, but in that time, the desert limestone tore into him. It was brutal. His left knee took a devastating impact, the sharp rock gashing through skin and into tissue. His hip slammed against the stone. His hands and arms scraped across the abrasive surface as he tried instinctively to break his fall, the limestone shredding skin like sandpaper. He tumbled and bounced until finally coming to rest at the bottom of the descent. Dazed and injured, Gilliland tried to assess the damage. Pain radiated from multiple points on his body. His knee was gashed and bleeding profusely. His hands and arms were lacerated and raw. But there was something else, something visibly horrifyingly wrong with his right hand. His ring finger was dislocated, sticking out from his hand at a 90-degree angle. The joint had been forced out of position during the fall, the finger now jutting sideways in a way that fingers aren't meant to bend. The sight of his own finger protruding at that unnatural angle must have been shocking, even through the pain and adrenaline of the moment. Gilliland knew he'd needed to reset the finger. Leaving it dislocated would cause additional damage and make treatment more complicated. With his other hand, he gripped the misaligned finger and pulled, manipulating it back into proper position. The pain of resetting a dislocated joint is intense. grinding bone against bone, forcing traumatized tissue back into alignment. But it had to be done. As he completed this grisly self-treatment, the bees found him again. More stings hit his already traumatized body. The swarm had followed him down the mountain, still pursuing what they perceived as a threat to their hive. Gilliland forced himself to his feet and ran again, despite the injury to his knee, despite the pain radiating from every part of his body. He managed another 50 yards, 46 meters, before encountering Fine and Lynn coming up the hill. The two men were shocked by what they saw, their companion bleeding from multiple wounds, covered in welts from bee stings, limping badly, clearly in severe distress. There was no time for detailed explanations. All three immediately turned and continued quickly down the hill toward their vehicle. The priority was distance, getting away from the bees, getting to safety, getting medical help. Lynn, a professional firefighter with emergency medical training, took charge once they reached the car. He examined Gilliland's worst injury, the gashed knee that was bleeding heavily. Using water from their supplies, Lynn rinsed the wound, trying to remove dirt and debris from the laceration. The cut was deep, serious enough to require immediate professional treatment. Lynn grabbed the cleanest material available, a clean sock, and used it as an improvised bandage, wrapping it tightly around the knee to control the bleeding. With Gilliland bandaged and loaded into the vehicle, Lynn began the drive to the nearest emergency room, approximately an hour away. It was a long hour. Gilliland sat in the car cataloging his injuries, the adrenaline beginning to wear off, the full extent of the damage becoming clear. The bee stings covered his exposed skin. His knee was severely lacerated, his hands and arms were shredded from the sharp limestone. His right thumb was broken. 2 of his fingers were broken. Scratches and bruises covered the rest of his body. The emergency room assessment confirmed what Gilliland already knew. He had suffered significant trauma. The bee stings alone could have been life-threatening if he'd been allergic, or if he'd received enough stings to cause systemic toxicity. The fall injuries required extensive treatment, cleaning and suturing the lacerations, setting and splinting the broken bones, treating the numerous abrasions and contusions. In the aftermath, as Gilliland recovered from his injuries, he learned a disturbing fact. The cave, Waterman Mountain Bat Cave, was known to a few other cave explorers to contain killer bees. This information had been documented. Others had encountered the hive and recognized the danger. But due to what some Arizona spelunkers called a cave secrecy ethic, a practice of not sharing cave locations or information to protect caves from vandalism and overuse, this critical safety information had never been made available to the broader caving community. The secrecy that might protect a cave from damage had nearly killed Gilliland. If he had known about the bees, he never would have approached the entrance. If Fine and Lynn had known, they could have warned him before he hiked up alone. The information that could have prevented his injuries existed, but the culture of secrecy had kept it locked away in the knowledge of a select few. Gilliland's injuries healed over time. The lacerations closed. The broken bones knit back together. The bee stings faded. But his statement after the incident highlighted a troubling reality in the caving community. Sometimes cave secrecy has serious safety consequences. The cave entrance at Waterman Mountain still houses the killer beehive. The sharp limestone still threatens anyone who falls. The approach hike still climbs 200 feet, 61 meters, through treacherous desert terrain. But the lesson remains. Moving rocks without knowing what lies behind them can unleash consequences that turn a routine cave visit into a fight for survival on a mountainside, pursued by thousands of aggressive bees while bleeding from multiple wounds. Cave exploration carries inherent risks: rockfall, bad air, navigation errors. But some risks are preventable when critical safety information is shared, rather than hidden behind walls of secrecy that protect caves at the expense of the people who explore them. January 1st, 2003, Philip Brown and his companions arrived at a small cave in Estill County, Kentucky, ready to start the new year with some underground exploration. The cave wasn't well known or extensively mapped, just one of thousands of small cave systems scattered throughout Kentucky's limestone country. But for cave enthusiasts, these obscure caves often held as much appeal as the famous systems. Every cave was different, every passage a potential discovery. The entrance alone should have warned them this wouldn't be an easy trip. A crack in the rock face, measuring just 12 inches by 16 inches, barely wider than a person's shoulders, not even tall enough to crawl through comfortably. Entering required contorting your body, squeezing through sideways, exhaling to make yourself smaller. It was the kind of entrance that made you second guess whether you really wanted to see what lay beyond. But Brown and his group committed to the squeeze. Once through the tight entrance crack, the cave opened slightly into a vertical chimney. To progress, they had to traverse across the top of a 10-foot, 3-meter pit, a technique called chimneying, where you brace yourself between opposing walls, moving carefully to avoid falling into the drop below. Beyond the chimney, traverse came another obstacle, a short keyhole passage. These passages get their name from their cross-sectional shape, wide at the bottom, narrowing to a slot at the top, like an old-fashioned keyhole. Navigating them requires specific body positioning, often moving sideways or at awkward angles to fit through the restriction. The keyhole opened at the top of a 30-foot, 9.1-meter pit. From here, the cave presumably continued deeper into passages that Brown and his companions wanted to explore. The pit wasn't insurmountable. Experienced spelunkers regularly negotiate such drops using rope techniques, but it required respect and careful movement. Brown was approximately 40 feet, 12.2 meters, inside the cave when he approached the pit. Something went wrong, whether he misjudged the edge in the dim light, whether a handhold failed, whether he simply lost his balance. The result was catastrophic. Brown fell 30 feet, 9.1 meters, down the pit, his body accelerating until it slammed into the floor below. The impact was devastating. His right lower leg took the brunt of the fall, the bone snapping under the force. Not just a simple fracture, a compound fracture where the broken bone pierces through the skin, creating an open wound that exposes internal tissue to contamination and infection. His hand was lacerated, likely from trying to grab something during the fall. His light was destroyed, the bulb smashed or the casing shattered, plunging him into absolute darkness. Brown's companions heard the fall, heard his cries of pain echoing up from the pit. They called down to him, established that he was conscious and could respond, but quickly realized the severity of the situation. Brown couldn't climb out, not with a compound fracture. They couldn't get him up without equipment and expertise they didn't possess. This required professional rescue. The companions made their way back through the keyhole passage, across the chimney traverse, and out through the impossibly tight entrance crack. They needed to get help immediately. Brown had specifically asked them to contact a cave rescue team. He understood that this wasn't a standard emergency that typical first responders were equipped to handle. Somewhere in the chain of communication, that request was lost or misunderstood. The call that went out dispatched the local fire department. These were dedicated professionals, trained for structure fires, vehicle accidents, medical emergencies, but not cave rescue. They arrived at the scene and began their response with the tools and knowledge they had. The firefighters squeezed through the 12 by 16 inch, 30 by 41 centimeter entrance crack and made their way to the pit. They could see Brown at the bottom. They could talk to him. But the keyhole passage and the 30-foot drop presented obstacles their training hadn't prepared them for. After several attempts to reach him, they realized they needed specialized help. While waiting for the right resources to arrive, the firefighters tried to help Brown however they could. The cave temperature remained constant year-round, probably in the low to mid-50s Fahrenheit, 11 to 13 degrees Celsius. That temperature, combined with Brown's immobility and his body's shock response to the injury, created a serious hypothermia risk. They dropped cotton blankets down to him, hoping he could at least stay warm. The blankets offered brief comfort, but the cave environment defeated them. Water dripped continuously into the pit, the constant seepage that characterizes Kentucky caves. Limestone slowly releasing moisture that has percolated through soil and rock. The water soaked the cotton blankets, and wet fabric conducts heat away from the body even faster than cold air alone. Brown sat at the bottom of the pit, injured in darkness, now wrapped in wet blankets that made him colder rather than warmer. Time passed slowly, for Brown, sitting in complete darkness with a compound fracture and hypothermia setting in, each minute must have felt endless. The pain from his broken leg would have been excruciating. Compound fractures often cause severe pain, as the broken bone ends move and damaged tissues are exposed. He couldn't see anything. He couldn't move without risking further injury. He could only sit and wait and hope that proper rescue was coming. The call went out to the Jessamine County Fire Department, 50 miles, 80 kilometers away. Unlike the local responders, this department had cave rescue training and equipment. Rescuers Chad Greathouse and Mark Traylor loaded their specialized gear and began the drive to Estill County. By the time they arrived and entered the cave, Brown had been at the bottom of the pit for approximately 5 hours. 5 hours in darkness, 5 hours in pain, 5 hours growing progressively colder despite the wet blankets. Greathouse and Traylor navigated through the entrance squeeze, across the chimney traverse, through the keyhole passage, and rigged the 30-foot pit with rope systems. They rappelled down to Brown and conducted a thorough assessment. The compound fracture of his lower right leg was immediately obvious, bone protruding through skin, the leg positioned at an unnatural angle. His hand was lacerated, blood dried on his skin. More concerning was the hypothermia. Brown's body temperature had dropped from sitting immobile in the cold, wet environment. His speech might have been slightly slurred, his movements sluggish, the early stages of hypothermia that, if allowed to progress, could become life-threatening. The rescuers checked for spinal injuries, carefully palpating Brown's neck and back, asking about sensation and movement in his extremities. Spinal trauma from a 30-foot fall was a serious possibility, and moving someone with an unstable spinal injury could cause permanent paralysis. Finding no signs of spinal damage, they proceeded with treatment. Greathouse and Traylor bandaged the lacerated hand first, a relatively simple injury, but one that needed attention to prevent infection. The leg required more careful work. They stabilized the compound fracture with a splint, immobilizing the broken bone to prevent further tissue damage during the rescue. Every movement of a compound fracture causes additional pain and risks worsening the injury, so proper splinting was critical. As they worked, they realized the exit would present significant challenges. The keyhole passage and the entrance squeeze were too small to pass a litter through. A standard cave rescue often involves packaging the victim in a rigid stretcher for protection during extraction, but the tight passages made that impossible. They would have to haul Brown up the pit in a harness, then guide him through the tight sections under his own power or with minimal support. Before beginning the extraction, Greathouse and Traylor addressed the hypothermia. They constructed a heat tent using a space blanket, metallized plastic that reflects body heat back to the person wrapped in it, and a carbide lamp. The lamp produced not just light, but heat from its burning acetylene flame. Inside the improvised tent, the temperature rose quickly. For the first time in hours, Brown began to warm up. While Brown warmed, surface crews rigged a haul system from outside the cave. The rope ran through several directional pulleys, devices that changed the angle of the rope while reducing friction, through the cave passages and down to the pit. This configuration would allow rescuers on the surface to do the heavy work of hauling, reducing the number of people needed in the already cramped cave. Greathouse attached himself and Brown to the haul line. The surface team began pulling. Slowly, the rope system lifted both rescuer and victim up the 30-foot shaft. The ascent required careful coordination. Too fast, and they'd slam into the rock walls. Too slow, and Brown's damaged leg would suffer from prolonged hanging in the harness. As they reached the top of the pit, the next challenge began. Greathouse switched from the haul line to the rappel line, a maneuver that required precise rope work while managing Brown's weight and injured condition. Then came the keyhole passage. Greathouse guided Brown through the restriction, his broken leg making the tight squeeze agonizing. Every movement, every touch against rock sent pain through the damaged limb. They navigated past the keyhole and faced the 10-foot drop. Brown was lowered down on rope, then hauled up the other side. The chimney traverse, which had required careful bracing on the way in, now had to be crossed with an injured person. Finally, they reached the entrance squeeze, that 12 by 16-inch crack that was barely passable for a healthy person, now needing to accommodate someone with a splinted leg. Somehow, they pulled Brown through. He emerged into the winter air, where the temperature hovered just above freezing, about 32 to 34 degrees Fahrenheit, 0 to 1 degree Celsius. After the relative warmth of the heat tent, the surface temperature hit him immediately. His body, already stressed from injury and hypothermia, began losing heat again. Rescuers placed Brown in a litter and hauled him up the hillside to where an ambulance waited. He was transported to a hospital for definitive treatment, likely surgery to clean and set the compound fracture, treatment for the hand laceration, and monitoring for complications from the hypothermia. The rescue had succeeded, but it highlighted serious issues in emergency response coordination. Brown had specifically requested a cave rescue team, knowing that his situation required specialized skills. That request got lost in translation, resulting in well-meaning but unprepared local firefighters being dispatched first. The delay cost Brown hours of additional suffering in the cold and dark. Greathouse's report also noted technical lessons. The heat tent worked remarkably well. Brown warmed quickly and stayed warm until reaching the surface. But running the hall system from outside the cave, while reducing congestion in tight passages, created excessive friction in the rope system and made communication difficult between the surface team and the rescuers with Brown. The small cave in Estill County returned to its quiet existence after the rescue. The 12 by 16-inch entrance crack still requires an awkward squeeze. The chimney traverse still spans the 10-foot pit. The keyhole passage still demands precise body positioning, and the 30-foot shaft still drops into darkness. Summer of 1977. 7 cave explorers entered McClure's Cave in Pennsylvania with enthusiasm for the underground passages that awaited them. The group represented a mix of experience levels. Some had explored caves for years, while others were relatively new to the sport. McClure's Cave offered both accessible sections for beginners and challenging passages for those seeking more difficult terrain. The exploration consumed hours as they navigated through various passages, examining formations, documenting routes, and pushing into sections of the cave that required crawling, climbing, and squeezing through tight restrictions. The physical exertion accumulated slowly, each movement requiring energy, each passage demanding focus and effort. By late afternoon, the group was tired, not dangerously exhausted, but feeling the cumulative fatigue of hours spent crawling through confined spaces, contorting bodies around obstacles, and breathing the cave's stale air. They made the decision to exit. Everyone was ready to leave, to feel fresh air, to stand upright without rock pressing from all sides, to rest muscles that had been working for hours in awkward positions. The group gathered and began making their way toward the entrance. The route out included a section called the New Extension Crawl. This passage had a reputation among those who knew McClure's Cave. It was low, barely high enough to allow a person to move through on hands and knees, and in some sections requiring a flat-out belly crawl, with your face inches from the rock floor. It was tight, the walls pressing close on both sides, limiting movement to forward and backward with little room for adjustment. And it was long enough that once you committed to entering, retreat became more difficult than continuing forward. The group entered the New Extension Crawl together, moving in a line through the confined passage. In cave exploration, staying together in tight sections makes sense. If someone has trouble, help is immediately available. But this decision would transform a tiring exit into a desperate fight for oxygen. The novice was somewhere in the middle of the line when it happened. The passage narrowed further than expected, or perhaps fatigue made movements less coordinated. Whatever the cause, the novice became stuck. not dramatically wedged, but unable to move forward or backward effectively. In the tight confines, with limited leverage and restricted movement, even a minor entrapment becomes difficult to resolve. The novice struggled, trying to find the right body position to continue. Precious seconds turned into minutes. Behind and ahead, the other 6 waited in the crawl, unable to move past, unable to help effectively in the confined space. They were trapped, not by rock, but by the human blockage in the passage and by their decision to travel together through a restriction that allowed no room for maneuvering. The air in the new extension crawl was already compromised. Cave air quality varies dramatically depending on the passage configuration and airflow. Large passages with good circulation maintain breathable atmosphere indefinitely. But tight dead-end passages, especially low crawls where heavy carbon dioxide settles, can have dangerously depleted oxygen levels and elevated carbon dioxide concentrations. The new extension crawl, with its low ceiling and restricted cross-section, was exactly the type of passage where air quality problems develop. Under normal circumstances, the ones moving through the crawl would pass quickly, spending only minutes in the compromised air. But now, with 7 people stuck in a line, unable to move, the situation deteriorated rapidly. 7 sets of lungs were consuming the limited oxygen and exhaling carbon dioxide into the confined space. With no airflow to replenish oxygen or remove the carbon dioxide, the atmosphere became increasingly toxic. The first symptom was the breathing. It started subtly, each person noticing they were breathing slightly faster than the exertion of lying still warranted, but the panting intensified quickly. Bodies starved for oxygen automatically increase respiration rate, trying desperately to extract more oxygen from air that contains progressively less of it. Within minutes, all 7 were gasping, their chests heaving, pulling in breath after breath that satisfied less and less. The headaches came next, not the dull ache of dehydration or the sharp pain of injury, but the crushing, all-encompassing agony that comes from elevated carbon dioxide levels in the blood. Carbon dioxide poisoning, hypercapnia, produces headaches that feel like your skull is being compressed from the inside. The pain radiates through your head, behind your eyes, at the base of your skull. It's the kind of pain that makes thinking difficult, that overwhelms other sensations, that demands your complete attention. For the 7 spelunkers lying in the new extension crawl, the headaches hit almost simultaneously. Groans of pain echoed through the tight passage. Some pressed their foreheads against the cool rock floor, seeking any relief. Others squeezed their eyes shut, trying to block out the sensation. But there was no escape from the pain. It was internal, generated by their own body's response to the poisoned air they were breathing. The exhaustion advanced with terrifying speed. Hypoxia, oxygen deprivation, causes rapid fatigue as cells throughout the body struggle to function without adequate oxygen supply. Muscles become weak and unresponsive. Coordination deteriorates. Mental processes slow and become confused. What had been ordinary tiredness from a long day of caving transformed into the profound, bone-deep exhaustion of a body beginning to shut down. The group could feel it happening. Limbs that had been merely tired now felt impossibly heavy, as if weighted down with lead. The effort to lift an arm or shift position required concentration and will that was becoming harder to muster. Some began to feel their consciousness wavering, not quite passing out, but experiencing the graying of vision and the distant, disconnected sensation that precedes losing consciousness entirely. Fear added to their suffering. They understood what was happening. Hypoxia and carbon dioxide poisoning are known killers in confined spaces. Mining accidents, grain silo entrapments, industrial incidents. The stories of people succumbing to bad air are well documented and horrifying. Communication became difficult. Voices sounded strained, breath too short to form complete sentences. The psychological torture of the situation was as devastating as the physical symptoms. They were all together, suffering simultaneously, unable to help each other. They could hear each other's labored breathing, hear the gasps and groans of pain. Know that everyone was experiencing the same crushing headache and desperate hunger for oxygen. The shared suffering created a feedback loop of fear, each person's distress amplifying the others. The novice, knowing that their inability to navigate the tight spot was killing everyone, worked with frantic desperation despite the exhaustion and pain. For the others, waiting was agony. They couldn't rush forward to help. They couldn't turn around and retreat. They could only lie in the low crawl, breathing poisoned air, feeling their bodies failing, and hope that the novice would break free before everyone lost consciousness. The moment finally came. Through some combination of determination, the right body angle, and perhaps the altered state that extreme stress can produce, the novice found the way forward. They moved past the constriction that had held them. The line could move again, but moving required strength that had been depleted. The group forced themselves forward through sheer will, crawling when their bodies wanted to collapse, maintaining focus when their minds wanted to surrender to the darkness creeping at the edges of their vision. They moved as a wounded unit, each person's progress depending on the person ahead, no one able to stop or rest without dooming everyone behind them. The crawl seemed endless. Passages that had taken minutes to traverse on the way in now felt like miles of suffering. Every movement was measured and difficult. The headaches continued to pound. The breathing remained rapid and unsatisfying. Exhaustion threatened to overwhelm them with every foot of forward progress. But gradually, imperceptibly at first, the air began to improve. The passage was opening slightly, allowing better circulation. Fresh air was mixing with the carbon dioxide-laden atmosphere they'd been trapped in. The first person to reach better air gasped with relief, pulling in deep breaths that actually satisfied, feeling the fog in their mind beginning to clear. One by one, the 7 emerged from the new extension crawl into a larger passage where the air was breathable. They collapsed, lying on the cave floor, chests still heaving, but now pulling in oxygen-rich air. The headaches began to recede slowly, the crushing pressure easing degree by degree. Strength returned gradually as their bodies received the oxygen they desperately needed. The group sat in silence for long minutes, recovering, processing what had nearly happened. They had come terrifyingly close to becoming statistics. Spelunkers found dead in a low crawl, victims of bad air that had killed them while they lay trapped and unable to escape. The margin between their survival and that outcome had been measured in minutes, perhaps seconds. Eventually, they gathered the strength to continue to the entrance. The remaining passages were navigated with a new appreciation for fresh air, for space to move, for the simple ability to breathe without pain or effort. When they finally emerged from McClure's cave into the summer evening, the surface air felt like a gift, clean, abundant, life-giving. The incident revealed something that experienced cave explorers already knew, but others might not fully appreciate. Some caves have passages where the air itself is dangerous. Not dramatically so, not toxic gases that kill instantly, not oxygen-free zones that cause immediate unconsciousness, just subtly compromised air that becomes deadly when people are forced to breathe it for extended periods in confined spaces. The group left McClure's cave that summer evening with new respect for the invisible dangers of cave exploration. Rock falls could crush you, water could drown you, getting lost could strand you. But bad air could suffocate you while you lay there, fully conscious, unable to escape, feeling your body shut down one gasping breath at a time. They had survived, barely, because the stuck novice had freed themselves in time, and because they had maintained enough clarity and strength to crawl to safety. A few more minutes in the new extension crawl, and some or all of them might never have emerged at all. Late November, 1982. The last of the autumn leaves had fallen in rural Caldwell County, Kentucky. The air held that sharp chill that always comes before winter, the kind that makes your breath visible and sinks deep into your clothes. On the outskirts of Princeton, 3 young men made their way toward the woods, following a familiar footpath locals had used for years. Their destination was Lisanby Cave, a quiet, narrow limestone system carved into the Kentucky bedrock. It wasn't a show cave. It wasn't mapped for tourists. and it wasn't the kind of cave people traveled hours to explore. It was a locals-only place, a cave many young men in the county had visited at least once in their lives. It was tight, cold, and rugged. The three young friends, around the same age, had planned something different for the night. They weren't just going inside for a quick exploration. They were bringing blankets, food, and supplies. They intended to stay inside overnight, tucked away from the dropping temperatures, warmed by a controlled fire, as generations of locals had done in the past. One of the boys was 18 years old, strong, capable, and comfortable around the area's caves. He lived with epilepsy, an unpredictable condition that, at times, seized control of his body without warning. His friends knew he had episodes, but none of them had ever witnessed one underground. They reached the cave entrance just after sunset. The entrance to Lisambi Cave did not appear dramatic, just a jagged opening in the hillside, half covered by dead leaves and vines. But once you passed through that first threshold, the world changed instantly. They walked in single file. They moved deeper through the passage until the walls widened into a broader chamber, a place large enough to stand upright, large enough to set up camp. Burn marks on the rocks showed signs of past fires. This was the room locals typically use for overnight stays. The boys settled down to unpack their stuff. They arranged stones into a rough fire ring and then started a fire for their stay. The chamber lit up immediately. The fire warmed the chamber, pushing against the natural chill that seeped from the walls. They sat around the big fire, talking, laughing, and drifting between conversations. Time passed. The room glowed. Then everything changed. The 18-year-old stiffened. His hands curled tight. His jaw clenched. His eyes rolled back. His friends got quiet instantly. They stared as the seizure began. Violent, uncontrollable, and immediate. His arms shot outward, striking the ground. His body convulsed with sharp, powerful jerks. His legs kicked against the packed dirt. His breathing changed to rapid, strained bursts. His companions panicked. They grabbed his shoulders, trying to pin him safely, but the force of the convulsions threw his grip off. The fire crackled only feet away from the seizure. The young man's arm hit the dirt. His body rolled. His leg jerked violently. Then his torso twisted in a final convulsion, and he rolled directly toward the fire pit. His shirt touched the burning wood. Fire hit fabric. The cotton went up immediately. Flames spread across his torso within seconds, consuming cloth, climbing upward. One of his friends lunged forward, grabbing at the burning shirt, trying to pull it off. But the flames were too intense. His hands blistered instantly. He recoiled, screaming. The other boy scrambled backward before forcing himself to lunge forward again. He grabbed a blanket and smothered part of the flame, but the fire was already under the shirt, already on the skin, already spreading. The victim's body jerked again, not from the seizure, but from the burn searing across his chest and abdomen. His friends shouted over each other. One yelled for water. The other screamed to get him away from the fire. They dragged him back violently by his ankles, pulling him across the rock floor. His burned skin tore against the ground, leaving flakes of charred fabric and blistered flesh behind. They pulled him far away from the fire until the flames died out on his body. His shirt had burned away nearly completely. What remained clung to him in melted patches. The seizure stopped, but the silence that followed was worse. The boy lay on his side, groaning softly, breathing in short, trembling gasps. His skin was blistered, red, raw, and peeling in large patches. His eyes fluttered open and shut. He was conscious enough to feel everything, but too weak to speak. His two companions froze. Neither knew what to do. Neither had ever seen a seizure before. Neither had ever witnessed burns like this. Then instinct kicked in that they needed to get help. They looked at the entrance. It was far. The cave route was uneven, narrow, and unforgiving. But they had no choice. One of them stayed by the injured boy. He laid a blanket beneath his head, trying to keep him conscious. The other grabbed a flashlight and ran. By the time he reached the entrance, his legs were shaking, his throat raw from breathing hard. He ran straight into the cold night air, through the woods, across the clearing, and toward the nearest farmhouse. He didn't stop knocking until someone opened the door. The homeowner didn't waste a second. He grabbed his phone and he called for help. Within minutes, emergency calls went out. Local rescue authorities, volunteer firefighters, and members of rural EMS units mobilized. They knew Lisanbi Cave. They knew its layout, its tight passages, the difficulty of carrying someone out. They also knew they were racing against more than physical trauma. They were racing against shock, blood loss, and the temperature inside the cave, which, without the fire, would now be brutally cold against exposed, burned skin. Back inside the cave, the injured boy lay trembling. His remaining friend knelt beside him, talking softly, trying to keep him awake. His skin continued to blister. Every sound in the cave, the dripping water, the crackling embers, the shifting rocks, felt amplified. The friend kept checking his breathing, checking his pulse, terrified of what each moment might bring. Rescuers arrived at the cave entrance with flashlights, blankets, medical gear, and improvised equipment. They moved quickly. The first team descended into the cave, following the directions given by the surviving boy. Inside, minutes felt like hours. Then, from deep inside the cave passage, faint voices began to echo. Rescue workers entered the chamber. When they reached the chamber, they found the young man lying beside the remnants of the fire. His clothing was burned away across large sections of his body. His skin was blistered, charred, peeling. He was barely conscious, drifting in and out as rescuers approached. They stabilized his airway. They wrapped his body in sterile covers. They administered oxygen. They assessed his burns, deep, extensive, and life-threatening. Then he was moved to a stretcher. Now came the challenge of extraction. Every step back to the surface had to be taken carefully. The rescue took time, far more time than it took the boys to walk in. What had been a casual descent was now an exhausting technical evacuation. Inside the cave, the stretcher bumped along uneven rocks, scraping walls and brushing ceilings that came down dangerously low. Rescuers rotated positions constantly, trying to minimize movement. At one tight squeeze, they had to angle the stretcher nearly vertical to get it through. The boy cried out. The rescuers pushed forward anyway. There was no other choice. The trip to the entrance took far longer than their original descent, but step by step, they carried him toward the cold surface air and to survival. The moment the stretcher emerged from the cave mouth, a wave of fresh night air washed over the group. The boy was handed over to the waiting EMS team. From there, he was taken to a hospital, equipped to treat severe burn trauma. The official reporting noted the facts clearly. He was evacuated by local rescue authorities. He had suffered serious burns after falling into the fire during an epileptic seizure. His companions had left to find help, leaving him unattended in the moments after the seizure. The analysis was brief, blunt, and painfully accurate. Anyone prone to occasional physical malfunction should alert companions to proper remedial procedures before a trip. But the reality on the ground, in that chamber, inside that cave, was far more visceral. 3 young men entered Lisanbi Cave for an overnight adventure. They were not trained, they were not prepared for medical emergencies. They did not understand how to protect someone having a seizure, especially in a dangerous environment like a cave with an active fire pit. They did not anticipate the possibility of an emergency at all. It was March 1977 when an expedition of 4 was assigned a task inside a cave in Chiapas, Mexico. By the mid-1970s, Sumidero Yochib had already developed a reputation among serious spelunkers, a place that demanded respect without ever asking for it. Hidden beneath dense jungle in the highlands of Chiapas, the cave system was not defined by a single dramatic drop or a vast chamber, but by a relentless combination of water, vertical exposure, and confined spaces. The passages were shaped by flow, not comfort. Channels narrowed without warning. Water accelerated as it was funneled between rock walls, and the sound of moving water distorted distance and scale, making hazards feel farther away than they truly were. In Sumidero Yochib, danger rarely appeared suddenly. It unfolded quietly, often disguised as normal cave terrain. In the spring of 1977, a small expedition entered the system with a goal that seemed straightforward and practical. Carmen Swallow, Chris Albers, Warren Anderson, and Norm Pace, each in their early 30s and experienced underground, were not pushing new passages or testing limits. Their objective was to run a phone line down to Camp Wine, improving communication deeper in the cave. This kind of work was common in complex systems, and it required patience, precision, and familiarity with rigging rather than bravado. The plan involved navigating known routes, managing water exposure, and carefully placing equipment in spaces that were already understood. Nothing about the mission suggested imminent danger. The route took them to a familiar feature within the cave, a cable ladder that descended into a narrow canal. The ladder dropped down to flowing water that had carved a smooth channel through the rock, guiding everything in its path toward a waterfall further downstream. The water was active but not chaotic, fast but not yet violent. To manage the risk, the group had rigged a safety line, anchoring it with bolts at the top of the ladder, again at the bottom, and once more just above the falls. The intention was to create continuous protection through the canal, allowing the person to clip in and move deliberately while resisting the pull of the current. At the base of the ladder, the system converged. The bottom of the ladder itself was clipped into a carabiner. At the base of the drop it was rigged upon, tying the ladder and the safety line into the same zone of hardware. On the surface, the setup appeared adequate. Every component was in place. The anchors were solid, the rope was sound. Nothing looked compromised. But caves do not test systems gently. They test them with time, pressure, and repetition. Norm Pace descended first. His movements were controlled and practiced as he climbed down the cable ladder, water noise growing louder with every rung. By the time he reached the bottom, the roar of the canal filled the space completely, pressing against his awareness and making communication with the others above nearly impossible. He transitioned off the ladder and into the flowing canal, clipping into the safety line before beginning the slow process of stringing the phone line downstream. His focus narrowed to his hands, his footing, and the tension of the rope. Everything felt stable. Then, without warning, the stability vanished. There was no gradual shift, no increase in pull, no indication that anything had changed. One moment the safety line resisted the current, and the next, it no longer existed. The release was instantaneous. The water seized Pace and pulled him off balance before his body could react. He was dragged downstream and over the edge of the falls in a single violent motion. His sense of orientation erased as water and gravity took control. Pace did not plunge freely into open space. Instead, the sudden slack created by the released safety line arrested his movement partway down. He stopped violently, still attached, suspended directly within the waterfall itself. 30 cubic feet per second of water slammed into his body, hammering him from above and behind. The force pinned him in place, pressing him into the rope and twisting him upside down. His helmet struck the flow repeatedly as water filled his nose and mouth, leaving him unable to draw breath. For a brief moment, instinct took over. His body fought for air, his limbs flailed against the current, and his mind screamed for oxygen. But the water was too powerful to fight. Every attempt to move was swallowed by the flow. He could not pull himself up. He could not push himself away. He could only endure. Somehow, through the chaos, Pace managed to force his body into a partial rotation. It was not a clean movement, but a desperate adjustment driven by survival. He shoved his hard hat forward against his face, pressing the rim tightly to his forehead and cheeks. The helmet created a tiny pocket of space, a fragile barrier between his airway and the rushing water. It was not enough to breathe normally, but it prevented full submersion. It bought him time measured in seconds, then minutes. Above him, the rest of the group could do nothing. The waterfall drowned out any attempt to communicate. From their position, they could see only flashes of movement through spray and shadow. The rope was taut, the system locked in place, and Pace remained suspended beyond reach. Any attempt to intervene risked destabilizing the rigging entirely, potentially snapping gear or pulling him deeper into the falls. The cave offered no safe approach, No alternate angle, no room for correction. Time slowed unnaturally. Each minute stretched longer than the last. Pace remained trapped in the waterfall, absorbing constant punishment. His arms burned as he fought to keep the helmet in position. His neck strained against the torque of the rope. The water battered his body relentlessly, exploiting every gap, every moment of weakness. Consciousness became a fragile thing, something that required effort to maintain. If he lost focus for even a moment, if his helmet shifted or his grip failed, the water would flood his airway and end everything instantly. 15 minutes passed, then 20. From above, Pace appeared motionless. No signals. No movement that suggested control or awareness. The group was forced to confront a grim reality. A human body suspended in a waterfall, exposed to that level of force, could not survive indefinitely. Everything they knew about water, physiology, and time told them the same thing. Norm Pace was almost certainly already dead. With no viable rescue options left, they made a decision that felt final. They loosened the rope from the top bolt, not as a rescue maneuver, but as a recovery attempt. The goal was simply to free the body from the falls. It was an act of resignation rather than hope. As the rope slackened, the system changed. The added slack allowed Pace's position to shift slightly. His body dropped and swung, moving just enough to carry him out of the core of the waterfall. The crushing force disappeared almost instantly. The pressure eased. Air reached his lungs. Against all expectation, Norm Pace was still alive. Freed from the direct blast of water, he regained control in ragged, gasping breaths. Strength returned slowly, painfully, but enough for him to stabilize himself and move clear of the falls. What the group had believed was a recovery had become an accidental rescue, achieved not through planning or intervention, but through a decision made too late to matter, except that it did. Unable to reach Pace from the canal itself, the others diverted into an alternate passage that ran around the waterfall rather than through it. This route was wider and offered enough space to move, but it was colder and soaked with spray, and hypothermia became an immediate concern as they worked. By staying clear of the main flow, they were able to descend behind the waterfall, approaching Pace from the rear rather than from above. From this position, they passed him a rope, allowing him to transfer off the compromised safety line and pull himself out of the direct blast of water. Once clear of the falls, he descended down away from the waterfall. As soon as he reached the bottom, they carefully stabilized him and make their way back along the same alternate route, avoiding the canal entirely. After exiting, he was taken to the hospital for treatment. Later, analysis revealed the cause. The canal safety line had been clipped into a non-locking carabiner at the base of the ladder. The constant buffeting of the water had worked the gate open. Once released, the line lost tension, producing just enough slack to carry Pace over the falls while still keeping him attached. The system did not fail catastrophically. It failed just enough. A locking carabiner would have prevented the release entirely, but water does not test equipment once. It tests it continuously. It applies force patiently, mechanically, exploiting small weaknesses until systems unravel. In confined spaces, even minor design choices can become fatal. Pace survived because of chance and presence of mind. Chance placed him in slack rather than free fall. Presence of mind allowed him to create that tiny pocket of air beneath his helmet and endure minute after minute without surrendering to panic. Had he been caught fully in the solid core of the waterfall, the outcome would have been catastrophic. The force alone could have shattered gear, torn rope, or destroyed a human body beyond recognition. This particular cave did not take a life that day, but it came close, and it did so quietly, efficiently, and without warning, exactly the way caves usually do. December 15th, 1988. 3 cave divers stood at the edge of Emerald Sink in Wakulla County, Florida, preparing for what should have been a straightforward dive. All 3 held basic cave certification. They weren't novices stumbling into a cave with just open water training. They had been taught the rules, the techniques, the protocols that kept cave divers alive. Leading the group was Bill Cronin, an experienced diver with somewhere between 100 and 125 cave dives under his belt. In the cave diving community, that number represented serious experience. Cronin had configured his equipment in side mount style, twin 80 cubic foot, 11.1 liter, tanks attached to his sides rather than his back, a setup that provided better trim and easier access to valves. His two companions wore dual manifolded double 80s on their backs, a more traditional configuration that connected two tanks together with a single valve system. The group descended into Emerald Sink's crystal clear water. The entrance opened into passages that extended deep into Florida's limestone aquifer. A permanent guideline already laid by previous divers marked the main route, a continuous line that led from the entrance deep into the system and eventually connected to other sinks miles away. The three divers penetrated 800 feet, 244 meters, into the cave, following the existing guideline. The depth increased to 150 feet, 46 meters, deep enough that nitrogen narcosis could affect judgment, deep enough that air consumption accelerated significantly, deep enough that every minute spent at that depth would require careful decompression planning on the way out. At some point during their inbound penetration, they passed a line junction, a spot where another guideline branched off from the main line, leading to a different passage or exit point. In cave diving, line junctions represent critical decision points. Take the wrong branch, and you can end up in a completely different part of the cave system, potentially adding thousands of feet to your exit route. At the 800-foot mark, Cronin decided they had gone far enough. This was good judgment. Establishing a turnaround point based on distance, depth, and air supply is fundamental to safe cave diving. He signaled to his companions, "Turn around. Time to head back to the entrance." They began their exit, following the guideline back the way they had come. The line led them back through the passages they had just traversed. When they reached the junction, they had a choice: follow one branch or the other. They proceeded along a line that was marked with exit arrows. These arrows, small directional markers attached to guidelines at intervals, serve a critical purpose in cave diving. They point toward the nearest exit, providing unambiguous directional information, even in zero visibility conditions. If you're following a line and the arrows are pointing toward you, you're heading toward an exit. If the arrows are pointing away from you, you're heading deeper into the cave. The three divers were following arrows that pointed toward them. According to cave diving protocol, they were heading in the right direction. But then something happened that would transform this routine cave dive into a fatal disaster. Near the entrance, Cronin flashed his light at the other two divers, the underwater signal for, "Stop! I need to communicate something." He gave them a signal that caused immediate confusion. They were going the wrong way. His two companions looked at each other, then back at Cronin. Wrong way? How could they be going the wrong way? They were following a guideline marked with exit arrows pointing toward them. Every piece of training they had received, every protocol they had been taught, said that following arrows toward you meant you were heading toward an exit. But Cronin was the leader. He had 100 to 125 cave dives. He was the most experienced diver in the group. If he said they were going the wrong way, maybe he knew something they didn't. With misgivings, with a growing sense that something was terribly wrong, but unable to articulate exactly what, his companions turned around and followed Cronin back into the cave, away from the arrows that pointed toward exit, back toward the junction where they had made their turn. Back deeper into Emerald Sink, they reached the line junction again. Cronin pointed confidently into a deep tunnel, a passage that led away from the entrance, away from the route they had used to enter. What Cronin didn't know, what he couldn't see, was that this tunnel led to Clear-Cut Sink, another entrance to the system located approximately 5,000 feet, 1,524 meters away through dark, deep passages. His companions were now frightened. They checked their pressure gauges and saw what they had feared. Their air was running low. They had already used substantial gas during the initial penetration to 800 feet and 150 feet deep. They had used more air during their exit. And now they had reversed direction and were heading back into the cave, consuming additional gas with each breath. They were sure, absolutely certain, that the line with the exit arrows had been correct. The arrows had pointed toward them. That meant exit. That was the rule. That was what they had been taught. They tried to convince Cronin. They tried to communicate their certainty that the arrows meant they had been going the right direction. But underwater communication is limited to hand signals, light signals, and writing on slates. Complex arguments, detailed explanations, the kind of forceful disagreement that might change someone's mind. These are nearly impossible to convey in a cave at depth with limited air. Cronin was unmoved. He was the experienced leader. He was certain they needed to follow this deep tunnel. He was convinced the arrows had been misleading, or that they had misread the situation. His companions faced an impossible choice. Their air was running dangerously low. They were certain Cronin was wrong, but they couldn't convince him. If they followed him deeper into the cave toward Clear-Cut Sink, 5,000 feet away, they would almost certainly run out of air long before reaching that distant exit. But if they split up, they would be violating another fundamental cave diving rule: never separate from your buddy. The air gauges made the decision for them. They didn't have enough gas to follow Cronin. They would die if they continued deeper into the cave. With time running out and no way to change Cronin's mind, they made the agonizing decision to split up. The two companions turned back toward the line with the arrows, the line they knew was correct, the line that led to the entrance they had used. Cronin headed deeper into the cave, following the guideline toward Clear-Cut Sink, convinced he was leading his team to safety, even though his team was no longer following him. The two companions finned desperately toward the entrance, their gauges dropping toward empty with each breath. They followed the arrows, followed the line, followed the route that their training and their instincts told them was correct. They emerged from Emerald Sink with their tanks nearly exhausted, so low on air that they didn't have enough remaining to complete proper decompression. Decompression is critical after deep dives. Nitrogen absorbed into tissues at depth must be released gradually through stops at progressively shallower depths. Skipping or shortening decompression can cause decompression sickness, the bends, where nitrogen bubbles form in blood and tissues, causing pain, paralysis, or death. But the two survivors had oxygen available at the surface, pure oxygen that helps eliminate excess nitrogen from the body more rapidly than compressed air. They breathed the oxygen and monitored themselves for symptoms of decompression sickness. Somehow, despite inadequate decompression, they suffered no reported bend symptoms. They had survived. Time passed by. Bill Cronin did not arrive. They knew their tanks had nearly depleted. The same would be the case with Cronin. Without wasting any time, they immediately contacted the authorities. Recovery divers entered Emerald Sink to search for the missing diver. They followed the guideline deep into the system, past the junction, along the route toward Clear-Cut Sink. About 300 feet, 91 meters from the entrance, at approximately 117 feet, 36 meters depth, they found him. Cronin's body was in a pocket in the ceiling, a small depression or cavity in the limestone where he had ascended, perhaps in his final moments as his air ran out. The guideline at that point ran along the floor at 145 feet, 44 meters depth. Cronin had left the line and gone up, searching for something. Air, an exit, a way to survive, that wasn't there. The position of his body told a story. When cave divers run out of air, their final instinct is often to go up, even though up doesn't lead to the surface in a cave. The psychological pull toward ascent is powerful. In open water, going up means reaching air and safety. But in a cave, going up just means hitting the ceiling, finding a pocket, dying in a small void in the limestone, while the guideline that could have saved you lies 28 feet, 8.5 meters below. The investigation revealed the terrible irony. The exit arrows had been correct. If Cronin had trusted the arrows, if he had listened to his companions' concerns, if he had followed the most basic cave diving rule of following directional markers, he would have survived. Instead, he had trusted his own judgment over the arrows. He had convinced himself that he knew better than the directional markers that previous divers had carefully placed. What had caused Cronin's fatal error in judgment? Was it nitrogen narcosis at 150 feet affecting his thinking? Was it simple disorientation in passages that might have looked similar? Was it overconfidence from his 100-plus cave dives? The dangerous belief that experience meant he could trust his instincts over established protocols, the answer died with him in that ceiling pocket 300 feet into Emerald's sink.